that's where you have full fiber recruitment. When I say full, it's the maximum number of fibers that you can recruit. There's always some fibers that are left unrecruited. They are more reserved survival fibers that will kick in only when you have that life or death situation, or when a baby is trapped under a car and you have that big surge in adrenaline. But for most regular people, when the load on the bar represents 80-85% of what you can lift at that moment, that's where you have maximum fast twitch fiber recruitment. And that is important because fast twitch fibers have the greatest growth potential. If you want to maximize muscle growth, you want to fatigue those fast twitch fibers. So you need to do repetitions that represent at least 80% of your maximum. That does not mean lifting 80% weight. I'm going to get back to that in a few moments. But for now, understand that when the weight on the bar represents 80% of your capacities, at that moment, you will recruit all those recruitable fibers. Now, when the load gets even heavier compared to your maximum, 85, 88, 90, 95, 100, you cannot recruit more muscle fibers. So the way you can continue to keep up with the increased demand in force production is by increasing firing rate. Firing rate is how fast those fibers fire. Boom, 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 boom. The faster they're twitching, the more force they're producing. Firing rate adjustment affects mostly the fast twitch fibers. So here's how it works. Let's say you have a light load, 40%. You're recruiting mostly the slow twitch fibers at the start. If the weight gets heavier, you're going to bring in the intermediate fibers. If the load gets even heavier, you bring in the fast twitch fibers. If the load gets even heavier, now you are increasing firing rate. That's how muscle recruitment works. Now here's the interesting part, especially when talking about maximizing hypertrophy. Because from what I just saw, what I just told you, we would assume that you need to use a weight that is at least 80% of your maximum to get maximum growth, because that's at that 80% mark that you have full fiber recruitment. In reality, that's not exact. What I mentioned, it's not 80% on the bar where you have full recruitment. It's when the weight on the bar represent 80% of what you can lift at that moment that you have full fiber recruitment. So if you look at the next table, we have 5 different loads, like 60%, 65, 70, 75, 80%. And I explain what goes on from rep to rep. Let's take the 70% column, for example. There is 70% on the bar. Rep number 1, the load on the bar actually feels or represents 70% of your maximum because you have no fatigue at that point. So the strength you have is maximum strength. But with every repetition you do, every time you lift a weight, you will accumulate some fatigue. And that fatigue decreases your strength potential, making that load relatively heavier. The load didn't increase, but because your strength decreased, that load on the bar represents a greater percentage of what you can lift at that moment. So if you have 70% on the bar, by rep number 5, now the weight feels like 78%. When you hit that 6th rep, it actually feels like 80%. 80% is where you have full fiber recruitment. So when you have 70% on the bar, those first 2 reps, they won't come close to recruiting the fast twitch fibers. You are recruiting the slow twitch fibers and some intermediate fibers. Rep number 3, 4, and 5, now you're relying heavily on those intermediate fibers. Slow twitch fibers still work, but these intermediate ones are working harder and harder. By the time you hit rep number 6, now those fast twitch fibers are being recruited. So every rep from that point on are what we call maximally effective reps for hypertrophy. Repetition where you are fatiguing those fast twitch fibers as much as possible. So when you look at all of those tables, you have 60%, 65, 70, 75, 80% on the table. And what you can see is that the number of maximally effective reps is the same regardless of the weight on the bar. Because if I have 60% or 80%, At one point, I will create so much fatigue that the load does represent 80%. And from that point on, we have maximally effective reps. Since we are causing 2 to 4% fatigue on every rep, when you hit that maximally effective rep threshold, 80%, you roughly have 6 or 7 reps in you to stimulate growth, regardless of the weight on the bar. So if you have 80% of your maximum on the bar, then you can do 6, maybe 7 reps. If you have 65% on the bar, maybe you can get 15 reps. But regardless of the number of reps, you still get 5 or 6 maximally effective reps. So that's why when you look at the study by Cameron and Mitchell that we will see in part number 3, even if you have a lightweight, 30% versus 80%, if both group train to failure until you can't move the bar anymore, both group will have the exact same amount of muscle growth in that study. The reason is that regardless of the weight on the bar, if you reach failure, it means that you accumulated so much fatigue that by the end of the set, that weight represents 100% of your maximum. When you hit failure, it's because the weight on the bar exceeds your maximum strength. So in both cases, you're going to have 5 or 6 maximally effective reps. The main difference is that with 30% on the bar, it might take you 40 repetitions to get there. So you have 6 maximally effective reps and 34 pre-fatigue reps. With 80%, you have those 6 maximally effective reps, but you have no wasted rep because you're recruiting the fast-twitch fibers from that first rep on. So that's the main difference. So we will see why personally I prefer not to ever go above 10 repetitions per set when training for hypertrophy, except with special populations. Those who have injuries, those who have less experience with training, bad mind-muscle connection, or a weak immune system, are older, producing too much cortisol, for the reason we talked about in part number 1, that those with a weakened immune system, they don't recover well from muscle damage. And as we will see in part number 3, the heavier the weight, the more muscle damage you cause, and the harder it is to recover from it. But besides that, if you have a normal person with a normal stress level, I always prefer to keep the reps between 5 and 10 when we're working to maximize muscle growth, because in that zone, you're going to have 5 or 6 maximally effective reps. If you do 15 reps per set, you're still getting 5 to 6 maximally effective reps, and you have 10 reps that contributes very little to muscle growth, if not creating fatigue, maybe accumulating cortisol. The limitation of the Cameron and Mitchell study that I will talk about in a future presentation is that they only looked at one exercise. So you had 3 sets with 30% versus 3 sets at 80% for 10 weeks, and both groups had the same amount of muscle growth. The thing is that in both groups, we had something like 18 maximally effective reps, because you have 6 per set for 3 sets. And maybe the group using 30% had a total of 80 pre-fatigue or garbage reps that didn't contribute anything to muscle growth, whereas the group with 80% had none of these reps. If you do one exercise, that's not too bad. But as we saw in part number 1, cortisol is cortisol is very tightly correlated with training volume. So if you have this method using 30% or 50% on 6 exercises per workout, the number of reps will be so high that energy expenditure will be higher. More energy means more cortisol, so that actually will have a detrimental impact on muscle growth. So if we apply the same schemes, 30% 3 sets to failure, with a regular training program, I'm willing to bet that the overall muscle growth would have been lower. Not because it's less effective, because you have more cortisol being produced. But for one exercise, that works. So what I personally want to do is to get those maximally effective reps with the fewest number of pre-fatigue or reps that do not contribute to muscle growth or don't contribute that much. Those who need more repetitions are those with bad mind-muscle connection. So they actually need more repetition to feel that muscle working, to get in the groove of the movement, to warm everything up, to wake up the nervous system. Because the nervous system is less efficient, they are not causing as much fatigue per rep. So they need to use those repetitions. But once the person is efficient, then I believe that for maximum hypertrophy, 5 to 10 reps is the optimal zone to train in. So that's for growth. Now, I want to briefly talk about strength. Even though it's not the main purpose of this presentation, I believe that hypertrophy and strength are intertwined, and most of the people who train in gyms who want to get more muscular also want to get stronger. And there's a lot of connection between both. The main difference is that for hypertrophy, all you need is to get those maximally effective reps, 15 to 25 for a muscle group to be exact. Or for an exercise if you're using those big compound movements to train a muscle. However, firing rate in that specific case doesn't matter. The number of reps or the proportion of reps that have a high firing rate don't matter, because all you want to get is more muscular. Now, if I want to get stronger, the real secret to maximum strength, in my opinion, is developing the capacity to have a high firing rate on those recruited fibers. And firing rate, increasing firing rate is a motor skill. The more you practice it, the better it becomes. And motor learning works this way. If I'm practicing golf, for example, I want to get good at golf. And I have, like, I'm hitting 10 balls. And 3 of those hits are amazing, technically perfect swings. But 7 of those swings are completely awful. Shitty technique, all over the place. What will the nervous system remember? Those perfect swings or those that sucked? Those that sucked will have a greater imprint on the nervous system because you have twice as many of them. The same thing applies to firing rate. If in a set, I have 3 reps with a very fast firing rate, okay? But 10 reps with a normal or lower firing rate. What will have the greatest effect on the nervous system's capacity to get that high firing rate? The slow reps, because you have many more of them. Those who want to maximize strength need the highest ratio of reps with a high firing rate as possible. And that means to me, as many reps as possible at more than 85% of what you can lift right now. Because at 80%, you have full fiber recruitment. From that point on, every rep will have a higher firing rate. The highest firing rate being on those last 2 reps, because it feels like 97, 100%. So if we look at 80% on the bar, okay? 80% on the bar, rep number 1 feels like 80%. So we don't have maximal firing rate. Rep number 2, 83%, still elevated. It's a bit elevated, but not that much. By rep number 3, we are reaching the threshold where we have a very fast firing rate. Number 4, number 5. So we're getting 3, maybe 4 reps with a very high firing rate versus 2 that have a low firing rate. Contributes to strength because you have more reps with a high firing rate. That's also why when you do sets of 3 reps, 3 reps, in my opinion, 3 reps per set is the best number of reps to maximize strength. Because you have, right from the start, more than 85%. When we are using 3 reps per set, it's 87, 88, and 90%. So all of those reps have a high firing rate, and none of the reps have a low firing rate. So from a motor learning point of view, all those reps contribute to making you stronger with a higher firing rate. And the further away you are moving from 3 reps, 6 reps, 9 reps, 10 reps, 12, 15 reps, the more the ratio moves toward a slow firing rate, so you don't have that great motor learning. So that's why lower reps work great for strength. Not just because, well, it's heavy, and I learned to feel the heavy weight, and that does contribute, but because you are working on increasing firing rate. When we're gonna be talking about the training methods, especially the strength training methods, we will talk about increasing firing rate quite a bit with cluster training, with heavy partials, with heavy rest pauses. These methods are designed to develop a high firing rate. Eccentric accentuation, same thing. These methods lead to a high firing rate, which is a secret for strength. So for size, what you want is getting those 15 to 25 reps that feels like more than 80%. With strength, you want a high ratio of reps that feel like more than 85% of what you can lift right now. Not just the number, but the ratio. The ratio is actually more important than the number. If I'm getting 5 reps with very high firing rate and no reps with a slow firing rate, it's better than getting 10 reps with a very high firing rate, but 20 reps with a low firing rate from a motor learning perspective. So these are the elements I want you to understand and remember when it comes to how the muscles and the nervous system works when recruiting fibers during a rep, during a set. And when we're going to be talking about the loading schemes, these will come back, and even more when we're going to be talking about the training methods.